Post-memory. How did I think of this word? I think I already mentioned a little bit about the kind of personal connections that led me to my work, and really the idea of post-memory came out of reading Art Spiegelman's Maus. Here he was, the son of survivors from Auschwitz, two survivors from Auschwitz, who did something really unbelievable. He drew the story of his family and of these survivors as a comic, and he did it as an animal fable. Jews are mice, and Germans are cats, and Poles are pigs, and Americans are dogs, and it was a really seemed like a very irreverent way to tell the story. But what I found so powerful about that story is something that I identified with completely, which was that he was trying to tell a story that had completely marked his life, but that was not his own story. He didn't remember it. But he was totally shaped by it. And I felt like he was doing something there that needed a term. And when I read the book, I read it very autobiographically. And I realized when I was reading it that I really shared his mental landscape, which had to do with the fact that I felt like I remembered some of the stories that my parents had told me about their youth, specifically about the war, more strongly than I remembered some of my own experiences as a child. They had a stronger, a more powerful place in my memory. And I felt like I needed a term through which to explain that. So I thought of this idea of post-memory. I was reading, there were so many posts at the time, postmodern, post-colonial, post-feminism already, post-everything. And it seemed like it was a kind of degraded notion of that. It had many different meanings, and I liked that. Some of the posts are positive, some are more negative. Some of the posts mean after, but I very much like the notion that one of my colleagues recently, in a discussion of the post and the phenomenon of the post, she talked about it as one of like a yellow sticky that you stick on to your piece of paper, and when it's there, it changes what's on your text, but if it falls off, but it could also fall off. So the post is something that's very tenuous, that's very fragile, that's kind of related, but not an integral part of the thing. But it doesn't necessarily take over or redefine what's there before the post, the actual concept. And then I also read a really interesting article by art historian Andrea Liss, who was talking about Holocaust photographs and who was also using this idea of post-memories, which had to do with public photographs from the Holocaust and how they inflect memories. And that was also very inspiring for me, and somehow we came to the same idea around the very same time. Then, of course, the concept has evolved. More, it has deepened. I tried to define it, how it works through examples. It wasn't really a concept that I wanted to impose on examples. I wanted to let it evolve from examples. So it became a way to think about a generational structure of memory and how memory is transmitted to the second generation, to subsequent generations. So it involved thinking about generations and why we think in generations. And it was a way to think about how memory is transmitted across time, but also in some ways across space for experiences that we might not ourselves have had, but that shape us and inflect who we are. I purposely didn't write a book on post-memory for a very long time. I developed the idea from the Maus article and the last chapter of my book, Family Frames, which was on a number of literary texts and artworks that were second-generation works. And then I continued to write about it in a series of essays that had to do with different texts that have to do with the study of the memory of the Holocaust and how it returns in work by second generation artists and writers. And those were then, I then shaped that into my book, The Generation of Post-Memory, but really it was work that happened through 15 years because what I wanted to do was let the concept speak to me and see how it works slowly. It really required thought, it required slow thinking. It was picked up very fast by other people, and that, in a sense, was helpful to me because I also felt like the dialogue and to see how other people use it was helpful to me in thinking about it. One thing that happens when you float a notion like this is that, the place you define it, the 3 sentences or the 3 lines in which you define it are the ones that people then write, use, and then they use it for their own purposes. And, I wrote about it in many different places, but it was always those 3 lines that came back to me. And that was a little frustrating because the concept had already grown and developed beyond those 3 lines. And that's why I thought, putting some of those essays together into a book and reshaping them to make a book would give people a more, a fuller notion of how, how the concept has grown beyond that first definition. So that was really the only frustration. Otherwise, the way that it's been used has been helpful because I feel like I've been in dialogue with a lot of different people and that it's opened up, it's enabled people to work on issues that were important. It's opened the space for them to think about some of these questions of the transmission of memory across generations. When I first wrote about post-memory, I wanted to be very clear that it's not necessarily an identity structure, but it's a structure of transmission. So one image, for example, that was very important to me in Art Spiegelman is an image that I keep returning to, and it isn't really in Maus, it was in his first Maus in 1972. And there he draws a very famous photograph by Margaret Burke-White of survivors of Buchenwald, really, and his father was not in Buchenwald, his father was in Auschwitz. And it's that famous photograph where a number of survivors behind the barbed wire fence face the photographer. And Spiegelman draws that image, which is a public image which was published in Life magazine in the 1950s, and he puts an arrow in the back of it on one of the mouse heads, and he says, "Papa." And then he puts little corner edges around the image and photo corners as though it were something that he's included, so an image that comes out of his own family album. And that really helped me to think about how subsequent generations receive histories that aren't their own. They receive them through family stories, through private communications, but they also receive them through many other media and documents, public photographs, history books, museums, memorials, other people's stories. It's a very multiple kind of transmission. So I wanted it to be very clear that post-memory is not an identity formation, that it's not reserved to those who actually, to specific family histories. So, and that doesn't give more authority to those people to speak whose families have lived through the Holocaust more than other people who may be in the same generation who have also received these histories very powerfully. For me, that was very important because I didn't want to create a kind of authenticity of experience for those, who own those histories and who are allowed to speak, and others who aren't allowed to speak. And so that was a way of a bone of contention, because on the one hand I was critiqued for doing that when I wasn't doing that, because a lot of other people have done that. But on the other hand, people who were actually children of survivors said, "You're taking our experience away." Our experience is different from our classmates who may also have heard those stories and may also have had some nightmares, but it's not the same as living in a family of survivors. So then for me, in the book, I tried to distinguish between what I call familial post-memory and affiliative post-memory. And the affiliative is really a structure of affiliation that could be identification, that could be solidarity, that could be a form of response or responsibility of others that we might have in a kind of generational structure where we affiliate with some of those memories, but not necessarily because they come from an actual inheritance. The way the study of memory has evolved was very much centered on the Holocaust for a long time, because so many people kind of flocked to be able to tell those stories, and the theoretical work was very powerful, very sophisticated, and so that people who study other histories have kind of turned to the Holocaust for some concepts, but those concepts are eminently exportable. And in fact, we have a kind of globalized memory culture now where some of the thinking that evolves in specific contexts are also exchangeable between those concepts. So in the United States, the study of the memory of slavery and the post-memories of slavery through generations was very helpful to me because, as I said, Toni Morrison's Beloved, to me, was the first big Holocaust novel that I've ever read. When I read it in 1987, when it first came out, I thought, there isn't such a novel about the Holocaust. But of course, it's more generations removed. Maybe there will be such a novel eventually. But when I read that, the way memories marked on the body, the way bodies survive, the way stories are locked up, as one of the characters in Beloved says, in a little tin inside his chest and won't come out. I mean, all of that spoke to me as a child of Holocaust survivors and as a student of the memory of the Holocaust. So I feel that these histories speak to each other. They're connected, and we can connect them. When I first started studying the memories of the dictatorships in Latin America or apartheid in South Africa, I saw that, the ways that some of those memories were transmitted were actually not necessarily similar or comparable, but connected. And any of these histories should be studied necessarily in isolation. And I'm not one of those people who says, this is the worst crime. I mean, there's a whole sort of discussion now about competitive memories versus connective or multi-directional memories. And I think that's a very important discussion. And I feel that each of these histories has its own uniqueness, but that doesn't mean that they can't be studied in relation to each other. So for me, that's been a very important development in memory studies, that memory studies have come from many different directions and converge around certain questions and certain structures that we can illuminate from the perspective of a number of different histories and how they intersect.